Vietnam War. The History of the Vietnam War, made by Nathaniel S., Joshua P., and Billy G.
The beginning of the Vietnam War, also known as the Second Indochina War. The war started November 1st, 1955, and ended April 30th, 1975.
The war started in September 1945. Communist leader Ho Chi Minh declared an independent North Vietnam on September 1945. During the First Indochina War, the French returned to Bao Dai to power sub the South Vietnam in July 1949. With Saigon as its capital, armed conflict between the two states continued until a decisive battle at Dien Bien Phu ended in French defeated by Vietnam forces. The subsequent treaty negotiations at Geneva, at which Ho was represented by his associated Pa Van Dong Party Nation and Dog China and called the elections of reunifications in 1956.
The Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu was a climatic confirmation of the First Indochina War that took place between the 13th of March and the 7th of May in 1954. It was fought between the French Union and the French Far East Expeditionary Corps and the Vietnamese National Army and Communist Viet Minh. The French began an operation to insert and support their soldiers on Dien Bien Phu, deep in the autonomous, the Thai Federation in northwest Tonkin. The operation's purpose was to cut off enemy supply lines into the neighboring Kingdom of Laos, a French ally, and draw the Viet Minh into a major confrontation in order to cripple them. The French based their forces in an isolated but Fort Link camp that would be resupplied by air, a strategy adapted based on line. Before that, the Viet Minh had no anti-aircraft capability. North and South Vietnam created at Geneva Accords, July 1954. The Geneva Conference was entered to settle outstanding issues resulting from the Korean War and the First Indochina War and involved several nations. It took place in Geneva, Switzerland from 28th of April to 20th of July 1954. The part of the conference on the Korean question ended without adopting any declarations or proposals, and so is generally considered less relevant. On the other hand, the Geneva Accords that dealt with the dismantling of the French Indochina proved to have long-lasting repercussions. The crumbling of the French colonial empire in Southeast Asia led to the formation of the States of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, State of Vietnam, precursor of the future Republic of Vietnam or South Vietnam, the Kingdom of Cambodia, and the Kingdom of Laos. 3 agreements about French Indochina covering Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam were signed on 21st of July, 1954, and took effect 2 days later. U.S. troops land in South Vietnam. The involvement of the United States in the Vietnam War began in the 1950s and greatly escalated in 1965 until its withdrawal in 1973. The U.S. Military presence in Vietnam peaked in April 1969, with 543,000 military personnel stationed in the country. By the end of the U.S. involvement, more than 3.1 million Americans had been stationed in Vietnam, and 58,279 had been killed. Here we have a video of the USA bombing in North Vietnam. USA bomb North Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder was a gradual and sustained aerial bombardment campaign conducted by the United States U.S. 2nd Air Force Division, later 7th Air Force, U.S. Navy and Republic of Vietnam Air Force against North Vietnam, China, and North Korea from the 2nd of March 1965 until the 2nd of November 1968 during the Vietnam War. Who was involved in the war? Every country involved. USA, Vietnam, South Korea, Laos, Thailand, Australia, Cambodia, Taiwan, France, New Zealand, Soviet Union, Philippines, Spain, North Korea, and Cuba.
U.S. force murdered 5 civilians. My Lai, a sedition of Sun Mai village, was located in province at Quang Nai, roughly 7 miles, 11 km northeast of Quang Nai City. The area had been dubbed Pinkville by U.S. soldiers because of the reddish color used to indicate densely populated My Lai area on military maps. By the time Charlie Company of the 1st Peloton, 20th Infantry Regiment, Pinkville had earned a reputation and had heavily mined a hotbed of Viet Cong capacity. In January 1968, Charlie was one of the 3 companies tasked destruction of the 48th Baton, an especially effective Viet Cong unit operation in Charlie Company suffered dozens of casualties due to mines and booby traps, but it failed to engage the 48th Baton after the details of the Broad Tent offensive, the King offensive. The Viet Cong had returned to guerrilla tactical, intended to avoid direct encounters with the U.S. force.
At Obia Mountain, about a mile from the border with Laos, U.S. Power Patrol troopers attacked and entrenched North Vietnamese fighters in an attempt to cut off North Vietnamese infiltration from Laos. U.S. troops eventually captured the site temporarily, which would be nicknamed Hamburger Hill by journalists due to the brutal carnage of the 10-day battle.
The causes and effects of the Vietnam War. The causes. The defeat of France in the French Indochina War in 1954, after which Vietnam was divided into the communist-dominated North and democratic South. The second one, an insurgency of communist Vietnamese known as the Viet Cong against the South Vietnam Army beginning in the late 1950s that grew into an ongoing guerrilla campaign. The effects. The first one, the collapse of the South Vietnamese government in the spring of 1975, resulting in a communist takeover of the South. The second one, the discrediting of the U.S. theory that emergence of a unified communist Vietnam would produce a domino effect involving the spread of communism throughout the rest of Southeast Asia.
Gulf of Tonkin incident. Here's the Gulf of Tonkin located on the map. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, complex naval event in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of Vietnam that occurred from August 2nd to August 4th, 1964. During the Vietnam War, it was described the U.S. Congress of August 5th, 1964 as 2 unprovoked attacks by North Vietnam torpedo boats on the U.S. destroyer Maddox and Eternal Joy. The Gulf of Tonkin incident led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed President Lyndon B. Johnson to greatly escalate the U.S. military involvement in the war.
The Battle of Hamburger Hill, 13 to 20 May 1969, was fought by the U.S. Army and the Army of the Republic Vietnamese forces against people of the Army of Vietnam, PA Viet forces. During the operation, Alpaca Snow of the Vietnam War, drew the heavily fortified Hill 937, a ridge of the mountain of Ababia in central Vietnam, near its western border with Laos, and had a little strategic value. U.S. command orders it captured by a frontal assault, only to abandon it thereafter. The action caused a controversy among both the U.S. Armed Forces services and the public back home, and marked a turning point in the U.S. involvement.
The gradual withdrawal from Vietnam, 1969 through 1972. The Nixon administration gradually reduces the number of U.S. forces in South Vietnam, placing more burden on the ground forces of South Vietnam's ARVN as part of a strategy known as Vietnamese
Vietnamesization, U.S. troops in Vietnam are reduced from a peak of 549,000 in 1969 to 69,000 in 1972. Vietnamization falters, America exits. January-March 1971, in Operation Lam Son 719, ARVN troops with U.S. support invade Laos in an attempt to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They are forced to retreat and suffer heavy losses. June 1971, the New York Times publishes a series of articles detailing leaked Defense Department documents about the war, known as the Pentagon Papers. The report reveals the U.S. government had repeatedly and secretly increased U.S. involvement in the war. March-October 1972, the People's Army of Vietnam launches a large-scale, three-pronged Easter offensive against the Army of Republic of Vietnam and U.S. forces. While North Vietnam gains control of more territory in South Vietnam, the offensive isn't decisive below its military leaders had hoped for. December 1972, President Nixon orders the launch of the most intense air offense of the war in Operation Linebacker. The attacks, concentrated between Hanoi and Haiphong, drop roughly 20,000 tons of bombs over densely populated regions. January 22, 1973, former President Johnson dies in Texas at age 64. January 27, 1973, the Selective Service announces the end to the draft and institutes all volunteer military. January 27, 1973, President Nixon signs the Paris Peace Accords, ending direct U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese accept a ceasefire, but as U.S. troops depart Vietnam, North Vietnamese military officials continue plotting to overtake South Vietnam. February-April 1973, North Vietnam returns 591 American prisoners of war, including future U.S. Senator and presidential candidate John McCain, in what is known as Operation Homecoming.
How many were killed in the Vietnam War? The war dead. By the end of the war, some 58,220 Americans lose their lives. Vietnam will later release estimates that 1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters were killed, up to 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers died, and more civilians than 2 million civilians were killed both in the sides of wars. The fall of Saigon. The fall of Saigon was captured of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, by North Vietnam on April 30th, 1975. The event marked the end of the Vietnam War and the collapse of the South Vietnamese state, leading to a transition period and the formal reunification of Vietnam into Socialist Republic of Vietnam under the communist rule of July 2nd, 1976.
President Nixon signs Paris Peace Accords. In 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed by Vietnam, the U.S., and communists from South Vietnam. The agreement ended the Vietnam War by removing U.S. troops and halting fights. Even though U.S. ground troops had left 1972, Air and Naval Air Force remained in action. While the Senate didn't pass the accords, they stopped the war for a day.
History of the Vietnam War, made by Nathaniel S., Joshua P., and Billy G. Source: Wikipedia.